Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorgen, and as always, I'm here with Paul. And Paul, China is on the warpath. And by this, I mean they came out with a really serious statement in regards to what many would say any type of conflict that may come from the U.S., whether it be trade, et cetera, et cetera. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being part of the discussion. And what do you take as Trump starts the trade wars and the tariff wars? What do you think China is trying to say with this open public statement?
Well, first off, thanks also for being part of the discussion today, Ken. Pleasure as always. Let's put some context briefly on this because it is quite inflammatory. It's sort of come out swinging at the United States, not as the aggressor, but more of a, just you better rein your neck in and behave yourself, or there are going to be consequences. Now, of course, the Chinese comments came after Trump imposed this 25% tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada, but he also put 10% tariffs on imports from China. And these duties on Chinese goods, basically doubled the initial set of tariffs placed on China last month. Of course, and we'll come on to this in a minute, as soon as the United States did this, China did tit for tat, and we'll discuss some of the history and what the consequences of this are. So what exactly did the Chinese come out and say? Well, they issued this warning saying that it stands ready for any type of war with the United States in the aftermath of those tariffs being imposed by the Trump administration. The Chinese Foreign Ministry came out and said the tariffs would not lead to any resolution of US concerns about fentanyl originating in China. I'm not going to get into that discussion. The United States says one thing, China says something entirely different, and it's partly an excuse for the United States to put tariffs on Chinese goods, rather like the whole border issue with the Mexicans. Well, yes, you might say it's Mexico's fault and Canada's fault, but hang on a minute. It's also the United States' fault. They should be stopping these things getting into the country. It's not someone's responsibility to police the border of a neighboring country, meaning what gets into the country. What gets out, yes, but not what gets in the other side. So the Chinese came out and said, look, if you really want to solve the fentanyl issue, we need to talk together, that's in a way that's mutually beneficial to address both concerns. But this is the damning statement. And it was, if the US has other agendas in mind, and if the war is what the US wants, be it a tariff war, a trade war, or any other type of war, we're ready to fight to the end. Now, of course, that sounds very inflammatory, and to some extent it is. But what I would say is, and this is from my own personal understanding and perspective, this is where the West totally misunderstands. The Russians are nowhere near as ruthless and clinical as the Chinese will be. Whereas the United States is very ham-fisted, for example, with tariffs, the Chinese are very calculating, they're considerate, they think about this and they go, right, we're not just going to blanket tariff everything that the United States exports to us, China. So their initial response was placing tariffs of 10 to 15% on imported US goods like chicken, wheat, soybeans, and beef. Now, soybeans is a great example of this because this is one of these situations where previously the United States tried all this tariff policy, and we'll discuss that in a minute. And what did China do? Basically, they turned their back on US soybeans and they get them from Brazil instead. So they had an alternative market. They punished the Americans and hit them where it hurts. And the soybean farmers were furious in the United States because they lost very lucrative contracts with China. Because if you're going to put tariffs on the US good, they couldn't compete with the Brazilians. And you've also got to remember these, there's tariffs also that were placed during the Trump's first administration when he spectacularly failed with the first tariff trade war with the Chinese, so much so that the trade deficit with China only continued to grow. I mean, but you have to look that there's tariffs already on US goods at 25%. I mean, there has been some waivers issued by the Chinese, but these tariffs that China are putting on come into effect, in the next few days. I mean, but my philosophy on this is, I think the United States is stupid to put tariffs on. I'm not going to get into, because we discussed this before, but the nuts and bolts of it are, unless you have an alternative, all you're doing is going to create inflation. If you put tariffs on commodities like aluminium, then you get producer price inflation and secondary CPI inflation. And if you put tariffs on a widget that costs $10 and it's 25%, then the widget costs $12.50. So the US people pay for more. Where I think the problem is retaliating is ridiculous and pointless. And in fact, why bother? Because at the end of the day, when you put tariffs on a nation's goods, you're the one paying for it, not the United States or the Chinese, depending on who the exporter is. So don't retaliate, because then if you're buying goods, the widget that the Chinese would have paid $10 for is now $12.50, for example. Why penalize yourself and then create inflationary problems potentially, or it's less of a problem for China, but it's still a problem. Okay, if you have an alternative market like they do for soybeans, then tariffs work, because you're kicking that export market to your country in the teeth, and you've got an alternative. The US doesn't have these alternatives, but I think broadly responding is pointless. But in China's case, they're very clinical about what they do. They do things in a way to maximize the damage they can do to US companies specifically, or US markets. And that is designed to make the US companies and markets have a backlash against the government and go, look, you're killing us. We're trying to export more to the world, and you're putting these blanket tariffs on everything. And in the process, you're killing the market accessibility for us, as with soybeans, between the Brazilians and the United States. So, so that's one aspect with regards to tariffs, but I'll let you come in, Ken, and then we'll carry on the discussion.
One of the most, I find, inane, hypocritical, and contradictory things regarding this has been President Trump declaring on China they're the ones who have to solve the fentanyl issue. Well, the reality is that the fentanyl, in whatever form comes from China, is not the form that is the designer drug that's being brought into the U.S. and put out on the streets for whomever to take it. The fact of the matter is, fentanyl is used in medical procedures and that in medical drugs all over the world. The U.S. uses it, but it's a regulated substance. So I equate it to the fact that if you have codeine in cough syrup, well, that you used to be able to get over the counter, but then somebody nefariously uses it to turn it into methamphetamine. Okay, well, is it the country or the producer of the codeine? Is it their fault that somebody decided to do something illegal and corrupt? No. So blaming China for the fentanyl issue, one, to me, is absolutely beyond ludicrous. You got to go after those who change it into unlawful forms or forms that never should have been put into, and go after the people who take drugs. I mean, they're the ones who voluntarily do it. It's not like it's shoved down their throats. But that aside, the reality is that American companies in the 1990s voluntarily, and they got their congressman to pass the law, says, you know what, we're going to go ship our industry overseas to Vietnam, China, India, wherever for cheaper labor, so we can get the profits. And now those products are coming back because we don't produce them, and the U.S. is throwing a tantrum. Well, the reality is you should accept the fact that you can get cheaper products for the necessities you need, and then focus your industry on something that you can't get from China, can't get from Vietnam, can't get from wherever else in the world, and then offer to sell them. And that's how really industry should work and commerce should work.
Yeah. And the other point is the trade war. The trade war and the tariff wars are not the same thing. They're overlapping, but the trade war is, for example, the United States tried to cripple Huawei and failed. They've tried to restrict Chinese access to technology with this kind of chip war, which is increasingly blowing up in the face of the US because China makes these huge strides forward technologically. I mean, yes, they're not manufacturing lithography machines yet, but they did a previous podcast on that, which you can listen to if you haven't already done so. Don't want to repeat that. But the Chinese can equally cause the United States a lot of damage in terms of trade war by not giving certain US companies access to certain markets, or restricting access, or making certain onerous demands on them. They can also restrict exporting critical things like rare earths to the United States, or gallium, germanium. They've already done this. So, the Chinese can give as good as they get. And in fact, I made a post on X. The US is turning up with a knife to a gunfight when it comes to the economy and the financial system, because the US is going to need enormous amounts of investment in the future. The only nation that can do this is China. And Trump already said he wants Chinese investment. So, of course, if you want investment, don't actually upset the creditor nation. Also, China has enormous amounts of treasuries. People say it doesn't matter. Well, it does if they suddenly announce they've dumped all of them, or they decide to dump whatever they've got left, which is not 800 billion. It's nowhere near that. But say they came out and said, we've dumped 300 billion. You would have problems with this. So China can cause the United States a lot of pain with regards to not just exports and imports, but also to do with accessibility to certain resources they need, which China, also doesn't just have a monopoly on, like rare earths, but also, in terms of the processing of certain commodities and raw materials that the United States needs. They've also, of course, China has increasingly gone around the world. We discussed this with Eric in the recent chat or interview I did with him, where I pointed out Xi's going around talking to all these miners all over the world, and everyone laughed, going, what's the point? I said, the point is they're securing all the resources they can all around the world and getting control of those resources for importing into the market. But also, if you're buying up huge amounts of resources and storing them strategically, then that allows you in the future to dictate the market, also the price. And, if China wants to, it can dump a load of silver in the market to allow other countries to buy it, or it can sit on those strategic reserves and countless other things, copper, etc., etc. And that could impact the United States. So China can do an awful lot of damage to the US. I know everyone in the West likes to think China's economy is cratering, everything's falling apart. It's absolute nonsense. It's the biggest load of nonsense you've ever heard in your life. And, it's one of these things. I mean, if people keep saying it for 20 years and they're wrong, why are they going to be right after the 21st year? It's just a wishful thinking. The US should not be in a position to pick a gunfight and turn up with a knife. Now, the only other option apart from tariffs and trade is military. Now, the only military aspect that China's talking about here is not the United States and China going to war. It's never going to happen rather like the US and Russia will never go to war because they're nuclear powers. And if you see in the distance between China and the United States, they're not exactly going to be a ground invasion of China or a ground invasion of the United States. None of this is going to happen. This all revolves around Taiwan. That's why the Chinese are saying, if you're going to pick an argument over Taiwan, you're going to fight some proxy war, or you're going to in some way try to incite an incident in the South Pacific or Asia Pacific, we'll give as good as we get, and we'll take this to the bitter end, meaning not the end of China. We will just fight until on whatever we need to, and in the end, we will cause you immense damage. Again, people in the West don't believe this, but China is more prepared to throw the kitchen sink at the United States than Russia ever would. It's not in Russia's nature to want to do this. It's why Putin for a long time kept trusting the US. You won't enlarge in NATO. Oh, you'll make sure the Minsk agreements are honored. They were very naive and made decisions based on trust that the Chinese will only trust on the basis that there's verifiable reasons to do so. Otherwise, the trust is gone, and if they don't trust, there's no relationship. So Trump can do whatever he wants to do, and hopefully this is just a bit of trying to get China to export more to the US. But this tariff war risks creating problems between the two countries, because what's the one thing Trump's never going to put tariffs on Russian goods or anything like that? It's just never going to happen. But Trump needs to realize that if he wants to narrow the gap between China and the United States, and I'm in full agreement of doing that, there are ways of doing that. And this is not the way to do it. It failed in his first term of office, 2016, 2020, when, this kicked in 2018. Why is it going to succeed now? It failed during the Biden years when they didn't do anything to remove tariffs, and coming out going, we're going to put more tariffs on, is not the answer. And the warning is to make the United States realize we have the arsenal to cause you, the United States, immense damage. And don't imagine we won't do it, because China is not threatening the United States. It doesn't want to have conflict with them. It doesn't want conflict with anyone. But if you push China too far, they will take retaliatory action, and it will be cold, calculating, and pardon the noise in the background. And they will go and do their utmost to inflict enormous amounts of pain on the US economically, financially, if the US pushes this too far. So get around the table, air your grievances, get more Chinese investment, have an adult conversation to narrow the trade gap, to encourage the companies in the United States to potentially have better arrangements in working in China, which the Chinese are perfectly happy for them to do. Chinese investment inside the United States, find some way of working together, do it in a way that's win-win, but don't take a knife to a gunfight with China, because the outcome will not be pretty.
Yeah, this is not your 1980s Japan. This is China, which is not a vassal state and is far superior when it comes to productivity around the world. Paul, were there any final of the comments you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that's fine. Yeah.
As always, thank you very much for your insight and how important this information is. And
Yes,
everybody here. And everybody here at the Sirius Report Plus community, thank you as always for your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.